coming all the way out here just to hear you speak. That really challenges and energizes me, and folks ask me all the time why I travel so much. It's really to charge my batteries with groups like this who share the same beliefs I do, and I know that it's eventually going to be you more than the United States Congress that's going to change things. I want to thank the Freedom Foundation for having me here today and for all that you do, all the legislators that are here. We had about an hour-long discussion with a number of the legislators before we came in here, and it was a great time just to talk about how we could partner together. And my emphasis is the belief that if America is saved, it's going to come from the state level. And if it comes from the state level, it's going to come from groups like the Freedom Foundation and all those allied with it to create that critical mass that you've seen some of the results of today. It's very important. If I thought we could change things from inside Washington, I'd still be in the Senate. But I'm with the Heritage Foundation, and so we can partner with folks like you all over the country. I want to introduce our regional director, Ellen. Ellen Hubbard, stand up with the Heritage Foundation. And I particularly want to thank all the supporters of the Freedom Foundation, particularly the Legacy Society. And I'll tell you, Heritage does a lot of research. And one of the things we found is if members include the Freedom Foundation in their estate, they'll live on average about 10 years longer. That's just one extra benefit of we can tell that to folks at Heritage too. It does seem to work out that way. Folks have asked me what I miss about the Senate. Frankly, I feel pretty guilty when I say nothing at all. As a matter of fact, as soon as I left, a lot of great things immediately happened. Right in January, because I really started Heritage this January. The first thing that happened is I did not have to go to the inauguration this year. They were sitting there on the platform when you're not happy with the selection. But the next thing that happened was even better. I didn't have to go to the State of the Union speech. And the last time I went, I had just made myself infamous with the president when we were talking about taking down Obamacare, and I had announced to the nation that if we could stop him on the Obamacare, that would be his Waterloo. And that was played all over the nation, and the president was very insensitive to me and mentioned me by name in a number of speeches. So we were at the State of the Union, and he was covering Obamacare and talking about the things that were in it that we all knew were not in it, keeping your own health plan, saving the country money. And we were all sitting there biting our tongues, and then you know what happened next. Someone right behind me said, "You lie!" And so the president turned his gaze right at me, and I knew the cameras would be on me. Everyone thought that I did it. Later found out it was my colleague from South Carolina, Joe Wilson, who screamed, "You lie." It was funny, he talked about it later. He said he went home and called his wife, and his wife said, "Who was that idiot that yelled?" He had to confess it was him. I appreciate the work here that you're doing at the foundation. And just the story we just heard of a few people coming together and having an organization that can help organize that and actually accomplish something, stop something bad. We see that happening at the state level all over the country. And what people are beginning to sense is they can make a difference. And once Americans really believe that just one or two or three people can make a difference, it creates a type of energy and courage that inspires people all around them. And that's what we see with so many of the movements around the country. And I'm convinced that we have more than enough people with the right ideas, the energy, the resources that we need to turn our country around if we can just pull them all together and get us pulling in the same direction. That's what we want to help with at Heritage as we go forward. To see what one group like the Freedom Foundation does, for instance, with dealing with teachers' union dues and those not being allowed for political purposes. And the fact that you took that all the way to the Supreme Court and won it wasn't just about Washington or what's happening here. That created a crack in the armor of government unions all over the country. Gave people in other states confidence that we could change things. We could turn this thing around. Because if you've been in politics at all, you know that government unions particularly are some of the biggest enemies of freedom. Not the people who are in them, the workers, but the bosses and the whole concept. The people who started the labor union movement did not agree that there should be government unions. Whether it's George Meany or others, they always thought that it made no sense. Because in the private sector, it makes sense that workers can come together and bargain to share the profits of their labor. But on the government side, it's very different. Government workers, well, certainly they provide a service to us, are not creating value, they're not creating profits, and they in effect have a monopoly on that government power to negotiate. And what we see all over the country, the local, the state, and the federal level, is to continue to negotiate and push pensions and other benefits to such a point that it's bankrupting states and communities. The same as it did with General Motors. But the market tends to clean up the problems in the private sector unless the government bails them out. But the governments don't fail. At least we didn't think so until Detroit. But the proposition that our government workers will be unionized, and that they will then help government stay large by giving their contributions and labor to the Democratic Party, who then are basically incapable of cutting the size of government because their constituents demand it. We have to reverse this, and helping on the teacher side is a huge thing. And to see what happens in some states like Indiana, where Mitch Daniels makes a move and moves his state towards right to work, that creates an energy in Wisconsin that gave Scott Walker and their state legislators the hope that they could change things there and take on the Goliath of the unions. And when they did that, it even inspired Michigan, the birthplace of labor unions, to try the impossible. But that didn't happen overnight. That was a 20-year effort to develop the idea and to test the messaging and to learn that if you wanted to win there, you didn't talk about right to work. You talked about freedom in the workplace and how that would make the life better for union members and government workers. They won that, and again, all over the country now, you've got states realizing they can't compete with right to work states, with the environment that creates for business. That's why we have a big Boeing plant in South Carolina right now, which I appreciate you guys seeing. But let me tell you, Matt's covered just a lot about this concept of ideas. And America is an idea. We're not smarter people or better people than others in the world, but our idea has always been different from other countries. And America is really about the individual and building everything around the individual. I wrote a book several years ago called Saving Freedom that was comparing the concepts of freedom with the concepts of socialism. And in one of the chapters, I'm visual, so I was using a diagram of how we look at this as the American idea. You put the individual in a circle in the middle. And around that, you put the institutions of society, whether they be the family, the church, businesses, government, all the institutions that basically serve the individual. It gives the individual choices when businesses compete, schools compete, but it also creates the support for what the individual does. And that's how we see the world as folks who love freedom, is that the institutions are designed to build the character and the capability of individuals so that they can participate as citizens, so they can be successful in a free society. And that's how you build a society from the ground up. The other side, and the other diagram that I drew in the book, is the center is government, particularly the federal government. And around that is business and individuals, churches, and all that basically rely on the government. And when people ask, why can't they just get along in Washington? Why can't they find common ground and move things in the same direction? It's because we have a totally different idea of what is America and what makes us work. It's the difference between bottom up and top down. And what happens is now when I'm trying to work, or was trying to work with Democratic colleagues about cutting spending, cutting the size of government, that was completely out of the realm of possibility because they see government as the primary driver of our economy. Government spending as the primary driver of our economy. They see things that we see as destructive, such as dependency on government and what it does to the dignity and capabilities of individuals. They see food stamps and welfare as economic stimulus, as a way for government to redistribute wealth and at the same time stimulate the economy by stimulating consumption. And we talk about cutting government programs, cutting debt. It's completely out of the realm of possibility for them. And also politically, it's out of the realm of possibility since their constituents rely on big government. I've got a new book coming out that's called Falling in Love with America Again. It's built on this whole idea of Burke's concept of little platoons and how that creates public affection. And think about it. I know how I fell in love with America. It was just being involved at the lowest level with family and friends, church, community, my Rotary Club, the United Way. And then through all of those, I began working at the state level with people, all of this outside of government, recognizing that most politics has nothing to do with government. Politics is how we decide to live together. And most of that should be voluntary. My wife and I deciding how to run our house, our own church, we decide what the rules could be. My small business, we have our own employee manual. But we have to recognize that the more the government grows and intrudes into those little platoons, the more it tears down what makes this country great. We've seen how our attempts to solve the poverty problem with welfare have destroyed the American family, where we're approaching nearly half of Americans born out of wedlock. And the statistics that follow that are pretty dreadful. We've seen what governments have done to businesses as they've expanded regulation. Businesses' ability to control what they do, make their own rules, has become more and more difficult. And it's changed risk-taking, it's changed the dynamic in our economy. Churches are afraid now to hire people that share their faith because they can be discriminatory. And all of these little platoons are changing. Associations like the Boy Scouts that once had the freedom to set their own standards have been intimidated for decades by state and federal government and eventually have to give in. It should be the freedom in the private sector for people to decide how they want to live. And our goal as conservatives should not be to use the government to push our opinions on other people, but to make sure the government maintains our right to live in freedom within law and order framework. That's the difference, and that's why America is polarized right now. And the problem with big government, and I'll just go through a few of these, some of those we're covering in the book, is we just help folks to see that big government is not just wasteful and inefficient. It affects everything in our life. Because the reason we have big, huge banks on Wall Street is big government. They couldn't exist without Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the guarantees of big government. The rules are different. They're now classified too big to fail. They get lower interest rates. They make it harder for community banks to compete and for other banks to grow up and compete with them. If you read the Wall Street Journal sometime last week, they had an article about how big government now controls nonprofits all over the country. A third of the revenue of nonprofits in America now comes from the federal government. Do you wonder why nonprofits don't want small government and freedom? They're not. It cuts their own throat. Do you know why universities and professors are so liberal? It's because they're following incentive. Most of the grants that pay for the research projects that our professors do are coming from the federal government. And so when we talk about limited constitutional government, a lot of people now in the private sector don't like that. You don't think big banks like Dodd-Frank? They helped to write the legislation because it gave them an advantage. You think corporations, big corporations, are for freedom and free enterprise? Think again. They were the ones that went behind closed doors and supported things like Obamacare. It was big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies that got a carve out. And we've seen it from the U.S. Chamber time and time again. And I was a chamber member, I love the chamber. But the big guys, when the rubber hits the road on the big pieces of legislation, go behind closed doors and get their carve-outs and sell us out. They thrive on big, not free markets, but big government and control. So our goal to limit the federal government is a goal that affects all areas of our economy and our culture. And the way we do it is to remember that original idea that the Constitution lays out. We use the term federalism, very few people know what that means anymore. It sounds like more federal government. But what it is recognizing the states once came together and formed a federal government to do the things the states couldn't do themselves. Defend the states, making sure that interstate commerce worked, make sure there's equality and justice across the country. And there's really very little else it was supposed to do. The idea that the federal government should run health care and education, our energy system, our transportation system, our banking system, that was not the idea. Not only is it not a good idea, it's been proven that it doesn't work. And what we want to do in communicating with America, what are the solutions of these problems, is not just keep talking about cutting and Constitution. A lot of people don't know what we're talking about anymore. But to recognize that what we've been doing is not working. Most people are nodding their heads. And then to look at the states all around America that are doing things right. They're just beginning to demonstrate in a lot of ways that if they adopt these ideas of freedom that we talk about, that it makes life better for people. It gives them jobs, a higher quality of life, and more opportunity. You see states now that are developing their own energy, using new technology like fracking. And states like Pennsylvania are now creating jobs for people in the northern area of Pennsylvania, people in North Dakota. And suddenly, only a few years ago, Jimmy Carter was telling us America is going to be out of oil and natural gas in a few years. And now we see that for really literally hundreds of years to come, we can be the largest producer of oil and natural gas if the federal government lets us. And the prosperity that that could create, particularly with natural gas, that's a third less polluting than coal, creates incredible opportunities for us. Look at states that have implemented school choice. And the people who've been voting against school choice for years are benefiting the most from it. In Florida, you see now that African Americans and Hispanics, the gap has closed very quickly. The DC education scholarships, you've got up to 97% graduation in some cases of kids that had no chance at all in dangerous and failing schools are now in college. We've got their names, and we want to tell their stories all over the country. You see states that eliminate their income tax, and what that happens as far as attracting businesses. Or right-to-work states like South Carolina, I think we've got 24 of them now, and that's forcing other states to do the right thing. The ideas that you're here today to support are working, and we can show it all over the country. The ideas that the other side has been supporting for years are failing right in front of our eyes. We don't have to go to Greece and Portugal and Europe. We see Detroit. They can't blame that on Republican folks. There hadn't been a Republican mayor in over 50 years in Detroit. They've been run by big government unions, big government, liberal, Democrat, high tax and spend, high regulation. This was America's proudest premier city, highest per capita income in the country, probably in the world, made most of the tanks in World War II. The automobile industry was the pride of the world, nearly 2 million people. It's a third of that today. 400 liquor stores, not one chain supermarket. Only 7% of 8th graders read at the grade level. A third of the buildings are empty. This is liberal, progressive policy, unobstructed by any common sense. And we're seeing that in some states too. We know Illinois is close to bankruptcy. California is not far behind. What we hope to do is when these things start happening is instead of looking to Washington to help, they're going to look, and I'm talking about Washington, D.C., not Washington State, is they're going to look at success stories all over the country, and we're going to have the right ideas ready to go. And Washington State is right on the verge of moving over the top. A lot of smart people here, they're looking around the country, they don't want to be like Detroit or Illinois. They're starting to see what's successful in other states, and if we can keep the federal government from stopping you from doing your own thing, you'll keep your taxes low, and the people will gradually begin to come along with you, and that slight minority you have now will quickly turn into a majority if you keep doing what you're doing. The idea that made America great is still there. And I travel around the country to know that the passion for freedom is still in the hearts of every American. And it still works everywhere. We just need leadership at the state level, the local level, particularly at the federal level, to remind people what a wonderful country we live in, and what a great destiny we will have for our next generation if we will just recapture those ideas that made us great in the first place. This is not a complicated political idea, it's an American idea that's actually quite simple. And that if all we have to do is look at what's working today, we can see it in history, we can see it all over the world. The American idea of freedom based on individual can make this country better than it's ever been. And that's why I'm in Washington State today, is to partner with people who share these ideas, who can help us save our country. So I thank you for what you do. Thanks for supporting the Freedom Foundation and just keeping the concept of freedom in front of everyone here, because I think you're going to be a big part of turning our country around in a very short period of time. Thank you very much.